up to me and I'll give you the key. It's easy. Just keep on hopping, keep on rocking, and don't start stopping. Everything you need just to want to see. And if you want to make it better, you give it to me. I'll embrace it. I believe for you. You wouldn't believe what I see in you. So don't stop. Don't let the drip drop hop. Hold up and make it lovely, make it real, and make it yours. Don't stop.
All right, Zach, I'm super excited to have you on the show. Boy, you are a man after my own heart because you are a fat adapted endurance athlete. And for my people that don't know who you are, can you tell them who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I guess I would consider myself like a endurance athlete, coach, and podcast host. That's kind of where I spend a pretty big chunk of my time. I kind of got interested in running at a really early age, and through that exploration, which was pretty gradual, I wasn't like trying to like be a big runner in middle school and high school to the degree that you can see some specialization happening, but enough to stay interested in it. And then by the time I kind of got to college and really dove into the sport, tried to learn the ins and outs of it and things like that, I started recognizing kind of where my interests were within running, and that kind of led me to ultramarathons. So I ran my first ultra marathon in 2010. And then I was, at the time I thought like I'm going to do like a 50-mile race. And then I was 24 at the time. I thought, well, I'll do one just to kind of see what it's like. And then I probably won't do another one until I'm like in my 30s. Cause my thought was I'd focus more on just trying to run a fast marathon or something like that. And I ended up liking it enough where by that same time, the following year, I decided just to jump all in with ultra marathons, train specifically for those. So I've been kind of angling that direction from a training side of things the last 10 or so years. And along the way I've been able to break world records, win some national championships, compete on Team USA's 100-kilometer squad. So I went from kind of doing it as a passion to kind of creating my career around it, which has been kind of a cool journey for me specifically. And yeah, so now I'm 35. I still love it. Still think I got my fastest races ahead of me. So I'm excited to kind of see where the next few years take me and kind of keep pushing as hard as I can.
So I'm super interested in this because you're kind of from the low carb camp. When did you get into that part of things? Because you're a world record holder. Did that happen while you were low carb, or like when did this all come into fruition?
Yeah, it did. So I kind of got interested in, so I'm probably fairly unique in the sense that I haven't ran a 100-mile race without being low carb. I went low carb early in my ultra marathon running experience, where I had done 50 miles was the furthest I had gone when I first switched. So for me, it made a lot of sense. One was, I had some like, I would consider them minor health issues. And I don't know so much that the diet was the actual like mechanism that cleared these up. Whatever I had going on uniquely to myself, it happened to jive better for me. So I stuck with it and it continued. So I didn't really kick it. So to give you some context with there, like historically, I'd always been like a really good sleeper, pretty consistent energy levels throughout the course of the day. Didn't really have like big kind of roller coaster rides of high energy, low energy, anything like that. Until like late 2011, mid to late 2011, I started noticing that I'd wake up a lot during the night, wasn't sleeping through the night consistently, felt like I had plenty of energy to do my workouts, especially if I would do them in the first thing in the morning. But then like through the afternoon, it would just be like, I'd feel fine. And then I'd feel like I could take a nap and like anywhere essentially. And at the time I was a full-time teacher, so that wasn't really a great option. Obviously the kids are the ones who are supposed to sleep in the class, not the teachers. So I didn't really know what was going on other than I had a pretty crazy lifestyle, as anyone would probably attest to, training, sometimes upwards of 20 hours a week, working a full-time job and things like that. So I don't know that those scenarios were necessarily that unpredictable, but I was loving the lifestyle in the sense that I was just getting familiar with ultra marathons. I was excited to do it. The training and racing was going pretty good, all things considered. So I didn't necessarily want to pull back on that I wanted to try to navigate it a different way. And at kind of around the same time, I started learning a little more about like a low carbohydrate approach. And I decided during one of my off seasons, late 2011, just to kind of check it out and see firsthand, like what exactly it felt like, get that experience to see like what panned out, what didn't, specifically to me. And I didn't necessarily anticipate this, but the first week I started sleeping through the night again, like straight through the night, didn't wake up at all. So that was kind of like a little bit of a sign to me, you know, as someone, I mean, you understand this as well as anyone, like when you're working out hard, it's great if you can nail workouts, but if you're not sleeping and you're not recovering from those workouts, then you may as well scale back on the intensity, scale back on how much you're putting in order to be able to recover from it, or you're going to end up having a margin of diminishing returns where you're actually getting worse versus better despite doing more work. So to me, that was a big sign of, okay, if I can keep this going, this is going to allow me to do the training I want to do, and perhaps even increase it at times when I need to. And so that was good. I also noticed that just my energy levels throughout the course of the day were much more stable. So, you know, I wasn't kind of having these peaks where I felt like I was shot out of a cannon, but they weren't being met with these dips either, where I felt like I could lay down and take a nap at any point. It's just a little more like kind of straight line, which I preferred, especially when you're running long races like ultramarathons. You don't ever want to be shot out of a cannon. You want to be steady as can be as long as possible. So for me, then it was kind of after that first, say, like month or so doing it, and I started reintroducing some structured training. It was, okay, how do I navigate a periodized training schedule, which is what I would describe how I kind of prepare for events. I'll do like a big foundational element where I'm doing a lot of kind of what you consider like aerobic threshold or high end of easy work and just really getting efficient there. But ultimately, I'm going to go through the full cycle of short intervals, tempo runs, long intervals, ultimately start building up my long run and things that are very specific to the race I'm doing, whether that be the train or the intensity. But those different kind of phases of the training offer different lifestyles, essentially. So then it was like, well, how do I take, at the time, what was a pretty strict ketogenic diet, to make this work within the context of what I'm trying to do? Because, I mean, there's just, to say that there's good evidence of any nutritional strategy for running, you know, 100 miles or in what most people are going to take 20, 30 hours to do is it's essentially non-existent. Like, we're extrapolating forward at best in most cases. There's some small studies and things like that, but really it's like, it's very much an individual exploration at this point. And a lot of it comes down to you know, your own experience on long runs and races and how you're able to digest food during them, how you're able to tolerate that. Like, you know, the way I like to describe it is you got folks who can essentially eat 400 or 500 calories an hour and seemingly not get any digestive issues along the way, stay pretty even, not notice any abnormalities in their day-to-day life doing that. More power to them. You get folks like myself, and a lot of people actually in the sport. I think the most recent position paper stated that 60% of ultramarathon single day athletes are going to experience some sort of like digestion issue or some sort of like, you know, disruption from the fuel they're eating. And some of that could just be poor practice, but you know, some of it's just, so, you know, not everyone is really capable of mainlining 400 to 500 calories an hour for hour on hour and end and expect that to go well. So for those of us who are in that boat, I think the strategy needs to be skewed a little more towards being a little more efficient with how our body utilizes fat as a fuel source. And since the intensity has to come down when you're out there for that long, it's not as big of a variable to have to try to get over like it would maybe be, say, like if I were trying to run my fastest marathon or my fastest half marathon, where the intensity for those are going to be so oxygen demanding that you want to make sure you're as efficient at converting that as possible, which, you know, pulling glycogen out of a functioning muscle is going to be very quick versus breaking down fat, you know, converting that to ATP and going through that whole process. Just more steps, it's just more oxygen demanding then. So you kind of need a combination of either a low enough intensity to let that process happen without it necessarily negatively impacting you, or have other variables that improve, some of which you likely do not know about just because there, like I said before, there's just not a lot of research with ultramarathon stuff, to be a bigger improvement or a bigger variable adjustment comparatively to whatever kind of negative or step back you're going to take. So I guess the easy way to kind of look at this stuff, any of these things that I'm talking about, I think all these things, whether you take a high carbohydrate, moderate carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, strict ketogenic approach to ultramarathon, they're all likely going to come with a balance of pros and cons. And those pros and cons are going to be unique to the individual circumstance, the race, all sorts of things. So you have to eventually kind of just sit down and kind of figure out what is your kind of unique set of situations, and kind of come up with where the best starting point is, and then kind of go from there. For me as a low carbohydrate athlete, I find it actually a little easier to navigate this, because when I'm working with people and myself, when I transitioned, most people are just going to kind of find themselves at a moderate carbohydrate diet. If they just kind of go to the grocery store and grab the foods they're used to eating, they're probably going to find themselves in a moderate carbohydrate standpoint. So a lot of people kind of have that experience already. So if someone comes to me and says, hey, I'm really interested in doing a low carbohydrate diet for my ultra marathon, this is what I've done historically. Chances are, unless they had already tried low carb, keto, and they're coming to me to try to figure out, like, what am I doing wrong here? What are some mistakes I made? And what's kind of like your strategy within the context of this? Then I'm kind of working with them from a different angle, where we already kind of have some answers to one strategy at least. So it's just kind of an interesting problem solving thing that I really like to kind of work with people with and play around with myself. And with myself personally, like I was saying kind of earlier before, it does vary a bit. And I feel this is where I probably confuse people, is like they'll want to see what I'm eating during a race, and then they'll think, okay, well, that's what Zach eats all the time. But it's like, no, when I'm running 100 miles, that's a very unique experience. Maybe happens a handful of times a year at most. There's also off season where I'm not running at all. And then there's kind of base training where I'm running low intensity, but relatively high volume. Then there's the phase of training where I'm focusing on short intervals. It's like, that's a different exposure too. Starts phasing in strength work and things like that. There's a lot of moving parts there, from the energy output and the intensity at which you're doing it. So I think like that all has to be taken into consideration. And that's where I probably end up falling more in the low carbohydrate camp, or whatever you want to call it, more consistently than I would say like a strict ketogenic or like a zero carb type of an approach, which, some folks are going to be a little more kind of hardline along those parameters.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things here that we could go, a lot of directions we could go here with this, but I guess my first direction is if you are training at with low carbohydrates, are you like setting more of like a zone 2 type pace, something that is a little more fat oxidative, I guess, than glycolytic? Because at one point when your heart rate gets a lot higher, like you said, you're struggling it'll start struggling to convert that a little bit. So do you change your training paces per the kind of fuel that you're eating?
Yeah, if anything, it's probably more the reverse, where like I say, okay, this is the string of workouts I'm going to try to execute during this next block of training. And because of that, these are the fuel sources that I need to kind of start to like phase in. So I stay low carb even through the higher intensity phases of my training. It just goes up from, say, like maybe around 10% to 20, and maybe on the rare occasion 30% of my intake. And a lot of it's just trial and error that I've done over the years, where I kind of have found out, if I want this string of workouts to go well, this is the pattern of eating that's working, gonna produce the results that I've seen, or the best results that I've produced, versus an alternative. So the big thing that I noticed with myself personally is it's the timing of some of these things more so than it is the actual intensity of one given workout. So like if you give me a week and you said, okay, in 7 days, I want you to go to the track and go 12 by 400 meters, at your VO2 max, and just get a really good short interval session in. I could stay pretty strict keto for all those days leading into that and go out and nail that workout just as I would if I were moderate to high carbohydrate. The problem is if you try to start to build volume at that intensity at a frequent enough rate at which you're capable of doing, that's where you tend to run into problems, at least for me anyway. So let's say now, instead of giving me that 7 days, you say, okay, we're going to try to have 20% of your volume this week be at moderate to high intensity. So you're going to do some short intervals, you're going to do some long intervals. Maybe we'll have you do a tempo run or something like that during the week alongside whatever kind of easy mileage you're running. That scenario kind of run week in and week out is where I find when I stay very low carbohydrate, like ketogenic low, you get this kind of like scenario of what I guess you describe as like kind of like a downward sloping staircase of your muscle glycogen. And you eventually find a point where I kind of tanked out, or I went low enough where my body's like pulling back on what it's letting me do from a performance standpoint. So at that point, it just, I've done different strategies for that. For me, what I tend to find work better is just kind of increasing my daily carbohydrate intake a little bit to a little closer to maybe say 20% of my intake. And I don't know if it's because I've been doing low carb for as long as I have that I have some efficiencies that adapted over time or what, but it just doesn't seem like I need much more than that to still be able to hit those workouts. It's also probably a product of I'm not spending an entire season doing those type of intensity workouts multiple times a week either. I might be doing, say, like a 4 to 6 week block where I'm focusing on short intervals, and I'll have deload weeks in there too, where I kind of reduce the intensity. So it could be somewhat like that. Like I'd have to go back and actually run my own self-experiment through like a real legit marathon training plan to see like what other like alterations I would need to make on top of what I do for, say, 100-mile race. But ultimately I kind of get through some of those least specific to race intensity workouts earlier in my training plan and start moving on to things where I'm increasing my volume and targeting kind of goal race intensity, which is going to pretty much peak out at like my aerobic threshold, certainly for 100 miles, even if it's a flat, fast, controllable environment where, for me personally, I've been able to run 100 miles in 11 hours and 19 minutes. That's still at or below my aerobic threshold. So that intensity, when I'm trying to really develop that, I don't really need to go much past 10% of my intake from carbohydrates because I'm just not dipping into my glycogen stores fast enough. At least that's what it's showing up on the workout results in a manner in which I feel like I go out and I can't execute a workout. So for me personally, since like we don't have great research and it is kind of a little bit of an individual like thing, I think when it comes to nutrition with ultra marathons, I find that like you kind of just got to follow the results, and if the results are panning out, then that's great, and if not, then that's the time to kind of make adjustments and make changes. And that's kind of how I've navigated low carbohydrate in general. I've tried to stay away from like, well, I need to be strict keto or I need to be this percentage of carbohydrates because that makes me fit within this program. It's more like, what do I need to do to make sure my big things are happening properly, like hitting my workout splits, preparing for my race, having good races ultimately, but also keeping an eye on the things we talked about earlier. Like, am I sleeping well? Am I recovering from one workout to the next? Because it doesn't do me any good to increase my carbohydrates by say 50%, nail a couple of workouts, but not recover from them and not sleep well. Which again is going to be individual to the person. I mean, I know folks who have no problem doing that. So some of this I think is just kind of a case for just individual nutrition, for better or worse.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for myself, anecdotally, like this is totally me working on me, but I feel like when I started experimenting with keto and fasting and all these things, I started to notice that I don't make lactic acid like I used to. I used to get my legs would be the craziest pump on when I was cycling. And when I started fasting and things like that, the more and more in ketosis I got, the more and more easy it was for me to go further and like do some of these things. And I mean, there's a lot of people that say that, when you're fueling with carbohydrates, it's a pretty dirty fuel. And so you build that lactic acid because that's a byproduct. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so like blood lactate is kind of an interesting one because for one, like your body can actually use that. So it's more of a process of, can it use it quick enough? If I'm understanding it properly, like where you're going to get like that pain like you're describing, I think is when you kind of like overrun the system and you can't clear it fast enough. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're producing so much that you can't clear it, then you're going to have like all the byproducts from that and your body's going to have to clean that up. So Yeah, it could be that it's a cleaner burning fuel to burn fat. And that the trade-off may be that like you just can't burn as many matches during workouts and things like that. I think there's still probably some stuff to learn about that, especially as we get into the longer distance things where, some of that byproduct is maybe a bigger issue long term. But it is very interesting because I think like that's a common enough anecdote. And I mean, a lot of this stuff is anecdotes, but uh, I'll have folks, myself included, will stay lower carbohydrate and you experience less soreness the following day or less like residual fatigue after a big workout and things like that. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what that is because there's so many confounders, as is the entire nutrition industry, that like it could be a situation where let's say like, for example, I take someone who's just kind of following a pretty like basic unstructured diet, and because of that there's a fair bit of just like random junk in there that could get cleaned up, but it's not causing any major issues, at least in the short term. And then they decide, okay, I'm going to go low carb. And when they go low carb, they end up just cleaning up their diet in general. And that ends up kind of producing the situation where their body is bouncing back and recovering quicker because it was more about the removal of something than it was the addition of something, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm kind of interested in that is because although I don't condone a fruitarian diet, especially from a long-term, like I think that would be just a recipe for disaster in the majority of people. But I mean, there's folks that do that and they have that kind of similar report where like, hey, I just did this big event and I bounced back right away. The next day I'm like totally mobile. I'm not beat down. I'm not fatigued. I'm not destroyed from it. And it's like, you're literally doing the exact opposite of what I'm doing. So I think there's maybe something to that, but I think at this point we probably have as many questions as answers. And for me personally, I like that. I think that's cool that there's, that we're on a frontier of something, and who knows what'll get discovered over the years as more research gets done, more money gets pumped into it and that sort of stuff, when you can actually do some bigger, more in-depth things and kind of explore it.
Yeah, I like all of this. And I like something else that you said back there, and that was like, trying to eat enough calories and then still be able to digest them, because when you're running your body, I mean, most people don't run in a parasympathetic state, right? So, and it's a pretty common knowledge that when you are having an output like that your digestion definitely slows down. And that was another really interesting thing for myself, because I would have a hard time, like if I was really putting out hard and I would bring in calories, I would just want to puke. It was horrible, and so that's another place where I found a lot of success, because I wasn't having to bring in those calories as frequently. And so I feel like a lot of times also, not only are these people making it so that they're not performing right because your body is trying to put its energy towards digesting this food, but over time I feel like they're actually hurting their digestion because they're not being able to properly digest this food when they're training all the time, throwing this food at themselves. Does that make sense what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when I look at like the amount of fueling that one could do for a 100-mile race, I just imagine if that was all laid out on a table and I was asked try to eat this over the course of the day, it would be hard to feel good eating that just sitting there, much less trying to run 100 miles. So to me, it's like, I think there's a path forward with that for some people, at least in the short term. I think there's maybe some reason to be cautious around that type of a behavior from a long-term standpoint, but that is yet to be seen. But the thing is with it, I think like where you run into issues with a lot of folks is it is going to be a coin flip. If you're going to try to hit, say, 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, or the recommendations for ultramarathoners is 50 to 70 grams per hour for like a single day race. And, there's going to be people who that just doesn't work for, and you can make an argument that they didn't properly train their gut to be able to tolerate that. But then you have to ask themselves, well, what do they need to do to properly train their gut to tolerate 50 to 70 grams of an engineered fuel source? Although most ultramarathoners, to be fair, are going to be encouraged to do kind of like a combination of like engineered products like, gels, sports drinks and things like that, but also have some solid foods blended in. And that should help at least a bit with the digestion. But I mean, if you're asking someone to train their gut, you're assuming that their entire focus is performance and that they have the workload capacity to actually do that. So like if I look at someone, say like Eliud Kipchoge, who's the world record holder in the marathon and likely one of the, if not the best marathoner to ever run, he can probably afford to train his gut because he's going to be training 100, maybe 140 miles a week. He's like got probably 4 to 5% body fat. The guy's not trying to lose weight. And he's racing a very interesting event that takes him about 2 hours to do, which is going to be structured in a way where he can almost maintain his lactate threshold for the entirety of that race, which is insane because the average person could maybe maintain that intensity relative to them for about 60 minutes. So it's just this insane comparison for most people who are probably doing the sport for a variety of reasons. They probably enjoy it as a way to stay in shape and stay active. So they picked it. Maybe they do to a degree want to try to get the best race out of themselves. I think most people do, regardless of whether that's in the front of the pack or the back of the pack. But they're also juggling a lot of other things like, maybe they only have 10 hours a week to train total. They have a full-time job, they have kids. And this is most people's reality. So for that person to be able to train their gut and essentially go out for like a 60-minute easy run and have a gel during it, just doesn't make any sense from just an overall health and nutrition standpoint to me. And I think the person who described it best was Dr. Mike Nelson. He said, really, I think there has to be some middle ground here to a degree, and it's got to be kind of circumstantial based, because he's like, the way he described it, if you go like really high carbohydrate, it's like the same thing as if you had like a sports car parked in your driveway in neutral and you're just revving the gas pedal. It's like you're burning this like high octane fuel source and not going anywhere. Because if you're eating super high carbohydrate, you're asking your body to burn that fuel source for a variety of different things, not just the high intensity stuff. If I went up to say 70% of my intake from carbohydrate, that's going to take front seat. So if I'm consistently eating that, spreading it out through the course of the day, I'm going to be burning higher rates of carbohydrate, even sitting on the couch, than I would be if I'm reducing that carbohydrate to a degree. So to some degree, I think it kind of comes down to like, what do you want your foundational energy expenditure to come from? And if you're an ultra marathoner, you want that to be fat because there's just no way you can eat enough during a 100-mile race to make up for the energy deficit. So you need to be able to burn high enough rate of fat, or you will have issues with glycogen defense. The question becomes, where does that end up for you personally? And then we're kind of back to what I was talking about before. You get the folks who can tolerate 400 plus calories an hour. They can defend their muscle glycogen pretty well, even at pretty poor fat oxidation rates doing that. You get people who can't. You get someone who's like, they start getting a queasy stomach if they start going north of maybe 200 calories. That person is going to have less muscle glycogen defense capabilities from an exogenous carbohydrate source. So they may need to be burning higher rates of fat at any given intensity from a ratio standpoint, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And I mean, like, just using myself as an example, I'm kind of one of those that keeps it pretty low carb. I kind of do like a cyclical ketogenic type approach, and like loading for 100+ mile race, I'll be pretty much ketogenic all week, and then I'll have a carb meal the night before the race. I feel like that restores my muscle glycogen so that I have that higher glycolytically demanding stuff available, but my body is trained to be fat adapted at the same time. So I'm kind of able to use both fuel sources, I feel like, better than the average Joe, because I've trained myself to go both directions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the other thing to lean into there is you can spend, say, 36 hours before your final dinner bringing back a little bit of the carbohydrate to do what you said, to stock up or to top off your muscle glycogen, your liver glycogen. And then you're going to go to bed that night and you're going to have an overnight fast that's kind of just built into your routine. And that overnight fast, coupled with avoiding carbohydrates the morning of the event, starting the event and getting that engine kind of revving for the first 45 minutes or so, in that overnight fasted state, that carb absent breakfast, first 45 minutes of training, you're going to be burning high levels of fat at that point, probably even if you're, skewing towards moderate carbohydrate. So at that point, then you can start bringing in small amounts of carbohydrate during the event itself and kind of stay on top of that muscle glycogen throughout the course of it. Because even if it is, because people ask me this, like, well, why do you even have carbohydrates during a 100-mile race? Well, because it's long enough where, like, even if my ratios are super in favor of fat, I'm still going to be burning small amounts of muscle glycogen. And you couple that with 10, 11, 12 hours, you get yourself to the end of the race, and you could very easily deplete that muscle glycogen down to a point where your body starts defending it, which is going to just raise your perceived effort at a given pace. And obviously you don't want that. At the end of the race, you want to have the perceived effort feel as good or maybe even better because you're excited to be getting close and closing in on it. So I've always just found like small amounts of carbohydrate, once you kind of get going, kind of keeps you in that position where, I'm not tempting stomach distress fate because I'm still keeping it, for me personally, usually around 40 grams or lower per hour. It's pretty rare that usually if I get any sort of digestive issue at that rate of fueling, it's more to do with like something I screwed up with hydration or the heat or something like that, which takes a little bit of playing around with. But once I kind of get that accounted for, there's really no scenario, minus food poisoning, that I'm going to get a stomach issue from 40 grams of fuel per hour. And that kind of ensures that I'm not going to risk the glycogen defense error of, say, getting to mile 80, dipping low enough where my body's like, hey, we're going to spare the rest of this for more important things than you trying to win this race, or you trying to run X time and making it more harder on myself than it needs to be.
So I got a question for you then. How do you feel about exogenous ketones?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been fortunate. I've been able to talk with Brianna Stubbs a bit, who's one of the leading kind of ketone researchers, exogenous ketone researchers. And it seems like right now there's some promising, or at least a promising study that is looking at those as possibly a good recovery tool. I don't think any of the studies that I'm aware of have indicated that it's necessarily going to be a performance booster, as in like an intra-race fuel source, but it's hard to know because with something like that, you do have a risk, just like anything you put into your body during a race, you have the potential like stomach irritant type of thing. So it's hard to know like where the line gets drawn there between maybe it was helping, but you had a gastrointestinal issue from it, therefore you lost more time than you gained, kind of a situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot to be learned. At this point, I don't know that there's any evidence that would say like you should definitely be using this during an event and that's going to produce X results. I think there's maybe some convincing stuff, at least now, as kind of a recovery tool. So having like some exogenous ketones with protein or something like that post hard workout or post event would maybe be the more practical use for it at this point in time.
Interesting. I always like hearing what everybody says about these things. I mean, I use them on occasion. I like them. But I've always wondered if the elite people are. I know some are, some aren't. So
yeah, I know people who've used them even during races and things like that. And essentially, like, they're probably looking at it as, I know from experience it's not going to cause a stomach issue for me or anything negative, because they did their homework and they tried it out in training. So for them, it's like, well, on the off chance that this does actually help, I'm going to be ahead of the science. And since it's legal and since it's not causing me any ill effects, why not? So I can appreciate that too.
So how about this then? How do you feel about like mathetone training and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think if anyone does a thorough job there and really maximizes their potential within like a maximum aerobic function program, they're going to find themselves in a position where whatever they want to peak for, whether it be a 5K, 10K, half marathon, marathon, ultra marathon, 100-mile, 24 hours, whatever, they're in a great spot to kind of specifically prepare for that event. So I'll use that quite a bit. Actually, I'll use it actually kind of twice, but it's somewhat just circumstantial. First is I just like to start having that really, really fit. So I'll do it maybe a little differently. I don't do like 180 minus my age to come up with a number. I just target my aerobic threshold and try to do as much volume as I can recover from at my aerobic threshold to kind of try to bring that pace down. So that pace for me specifically, my aerobic threshold is about 155 beats per minute. So like if I'm getting down usually to a low 6, maybe dipping under 6-minute mile pace at that heart rate, in a really controlled environment, then I'm pretty well developed in that. And then the next question is like, how long can I tolerate that? Like, can I do 30 miles a week at that intensity and still recover? Or can I do 70 or 80? Because like 70 or 80 is just, more, I'm more efficient or able, I'm able to tolerate a bigger workload with that. So then once I kind of have that in place, then it's like, okay, well, what race am I going to do? And what do I need to do to kind of peak for that? So for me, I think there's still good reason to be doing some short intervals and things like that. It's just, they're not going to be specific to the races I'm personally going to pick. So I'm going to do them a little earlier in the training plan. So I might get through that phase where I'm really working on like my maximum aerobic function or my aerobic threshold. And then I might start implementing some short intervals, some long intervals, tempo runs, and then eventually probably even come back to that. Because my 100-mile intensity and pace isn't too far from my aerobic threshold. So it kind of becomes flat runnable 100 specific training again near the end of the plan. So I kind of revert back to that then. If it is 100 miles I'm doing, if I was going to say do a 5K though, I look at some of that maximum aerobic function stuff. I mean, that's what cross country kids should be doing in the summer before their season starts. Then when their season starts, they're super aerobically fit. So now their coach starts throwing short intervals at them, tempo runs at them, races on the weekends and a couple during the week maybe at them. And they're getting that intensity, and that is going to be specific to the event that they're trying to peak for. So they're getting that very specific workload that they need to be targeting to fine tune their race day intensity, their race day specifics and things like that. So you kind of have to let the racer kind of guide the order of operations to a degree. But I do think there's still value for that kind of variety of stuff included in the plan. For like, especially, I like to use the example of short intervals because it's the one that I think is the most polarizing compared to like maximum aerobic function, and certainly the most polarizing compared to 100-mile intensity. And the reason you do something like that is because by doing those short, fast intervals, what you're doing is you're kind of raising the ceiling or the potential that you have on your aerobic capacity. So you do those, and then that allows you to kind of break through what would maybe have been a plateau previously. And the way to maybe think about that is, even if I'm racing at a low intensity, there's this thing they call like a speed reserve, which is like the amount of like the amount of time or intensity that's going to come up between the pace you're racing at and what you could maximally put out. And if you have a big speed reserve, you just have more options to make mistakes because you're not pushing up against that red line quite as much. And it can go back to nutrition too, because if I have a really big speed reserve, then even regardless of diet, I'm going to be burning higher rates of fat, lower rates of carbohydrates at the intensity. So that's the other interesting thing. Like if you take someone with a much bigger engine than me and you give them, like, say, a moderate carbohydrate diet, you give me a low carbohydrate diet, if their speed reserve is much larger than mine, which it should be if they've got a bigger engine, if they're doing the right work anyway, then they might be able to eat more carbohydrates than me, but still burn the same ratios of carbs to fat because they've got that bigger energy or that bigger engine, and therefore they're racing at a lower intensity than I am. And there's just a lot, it gets kind of muddy at that point because it's not necessarily as linear as you got a big engine, therefore you're faster. There's a lot of things that come into play where, like, how long can you maintain an uncomfortable pace from one person to the next? How long can you stay at like your VO2 max before you start falling off? And you might have someone with a really big engine that falls off early, or someone with a really like a average or lower engine who can, for whatever reason, just grind. And I mean, you see these folks in the sport too, where, you'll get someone who's got like a low VO2 max versus someone with a high one. And then the person with the low one still wins, but it's just because for whatever reason, they, either trained better or, was able to push through the pain and all these other variables that sometimes get kind of missed when we're just looking at the paper and that sort of stuff.
Awesome. I like that. So, I guess I'm curious now, what's the furthest race that you have run?
The furthest I've run is 125 miles in one event. So it's kind of funny because ultramarathoning it's a long sport in the sense that, like, it's been around for a long time. I think people think it's relatively new because it's had a pretty big upswing the last decade or so. But it dates back to the 1800s in some of the formal manner. And I mean, there's events that are like 6 days where you see how far you can run in 6 days, and like 24-hour events where you can see how far you run in 24 hours. And the world record for that's like 188 miles, which is just like a ridiculous amount of running for a 24-hour window, and all sorts of other stuff. So yeah, I mean, I focused mostly on 100-mile stuff. I've taken a kind of a stab at a couple of 24 hours with essentially no success so far, but it is an event that I'm really interested in. I'm hoping to kind of solve and have some good races within and kind of later in my career.
That's awesome and amazing. Like it's so cool. I am not a runner. I'm a cyclist. I've tried to attempt running. I don't know if it's for me, but you do have a big run planned. Is it a fundraiser that you're going to be doing from San Francisco to New York?
Yeah. So when I first got into ultramarathon running, I caught wind of this. It's essentially more of a challenge. It's not really a race because they don't really have a bunch of people line up and see who gets to the end first. But there's like a few different routes that essentially go from either the West Coast to the East Coast. They call it the transcontinental run. And over the years, people will document their attempts, record them and things like that. So there is like precedent set from like records and things like that. So I was like, that's a super cool project. I'm going to do it someday. And at that point, it was just like, kind of like just something kind of in the back burner, more or less, that I wanted to do, but I didn't really actualize it in terms of picking a date and actually deciding to pull the trigger on it. So it kind of sat there for the better part of my career until a few years ago. I met this guy named Justin Wren, who he has a charity that he started called Fight for the Forgotten. And his mission as a humanitarian was to identify the most forgotten people on the planet and see what he could do to help them. So he had identified this tribe in the Congo, which is essentially right in the middle of Africa. And they basically had no human rights and were spending a ton of their manpower or woman power in this case, because it's usually the women that were doing the water gathering. I mean, they're spending all day doing it. And when you think about it, it's just like a really interesting and just polarizing like thought that you have like, I think like, here in the United States, we have all these opportunities that we can kind of take advantage of if we're aware of them and time them right. But if we had to spend all day just to get water, we'd have no choice but to do that. You'd have to let all the other opportunities go along the wayside, because if you don't have water, you're not going to be able to function and you're not going to be able to take advantage of those opportunities anyway. So like, he wanted to try to make sure, first things first, we need to work with the local government, make sure that anything we give to them doesn't just get taken away. Because that's one of the problems with just throwing money at these problems is there's a lot of times there's power in places that you maybe would otherwise not want it to be. And that can come at the cost. If you just throw the money at them, then it might bring more problems, because now all of a sudden they've got resources that someone else wants to take from them. So he worked with the local government, made sure it was in their best interest that he helped the Pygmy tribe. And his first thought was, okay, we need to get these folks wells so that they have clean, reliable water, so then they can start focusing on developing other things. So over the years, he's been able to build a ton of wells for them, which has turned into them being able to buy land. Because previously they were essentially living on top of their own burial mounds, because they just got basically pushed into this one really tiny area. And so now they have more land, they have wells, so they have clean water. So now they're building farms and permanent housing and things like that. So I just thought his mission was really cool, and his story was really cool. And it gave me kind of a purpose or a reason to do the Transcon project. And I reached out to him a few years ago asking if he'd have any interest in, partnering up with me for that. And was super excited about it. So we were actually going to do it last year, but then with COVID and everything, I had to kind of put it on pause for a bit. So here we are in 2021 now, and I'm looking to do it in September, where I'll run from San Francisco to New York, trying to do as many miles as I can fit in per day. The record is 42 days, 6 hours and 30 minutes by a guy named Pete Koselnick, which for those of you who aren't math geniuses and can just run those numbers through your head really, really quickly, that's like 72.5 miles a day. So it's an incredible, and Pete's one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. So you'll never hear him talking about his exploits, but he's also done this project. He's the man when it comes to these multi-day things. So he did this project where he ran from Keys, Alaska, all the way to the Florida Keys. So he essentially found the longest possible route in the United States. And he did that one unsupported. So like when I do this transcon run, I'm going to have an RV following me and like a chase car behind that RV, giving me whatever I need along the way. And as soon as I'm done for the day, I'm going to take a shower and go to bed and eat as much as I possibly can in between time. And he did the same thing when he did his transcon project, but for his keys to keys project, he did that unsupported. He pushed a stroller and he still averaged over 50 miles a day. So it's like,
holy cow, that's crazy.
yeah. So I've been fortunate to know him and talk to him and some of his crew too, to kind of help fine tune some of the logistics behind this. Cause for me, I've done all single day ultra marathons to date. So this is very new. This is like a scenario where I can't go out and completely exhaust myself on one day and expect to be able to get up and do that again and again and again for 40 plus days. You got to be able to kind of find that line that you can push up against, but not go past, so that you have something else to give the next day and the following days. And you can maybe take some risks near the end, but you got to be smart in the early stages and the middle stages. So kind of figuring out how to, go about that is kind of a big piece to my kind of training puzzle right now. Figuring out how to, eat 10,000 plus calories a day for 6+ weeks is another project that I'm going to be working on in the next few weeks to try to figure out exactly how that's going to look and what's going to be more digestible versus, intolerable, and all the stuff that kind of comes with that sort of thing. But I'm excited to do it. And I can't think of a better cause to do it for. So that'll be a big motivator to kind of keep me going. And when I feel bad about myself and why I'm doing it, I'll be thinking about, Justin and all the stuff he's done for other people who have no choice but to essentially suffer day in and day out. And that's, I think, a pretty big motivator when you have the choice whether you want to suffer or not.
I love that. That's amazing. And you brought up something there was the recovery. And that's what I was thinking the whole time. I was like, how the heck do you just do that day after day after day and not like have a recovery day? That seems like it's going to be a tough one.
Yeah. And I mean, there's definitely obviously things can happen that are outside of my control. So like the perfect scenario likely never happens. There's always going to be something that pops up. I mean, take Pete, for example. He got maybe a little too aggressive early and tweaked the tendon that kind of runs down his shin into his foot. And he had to take a full day off. So he averaged 72.5 miles a day with a day off. So he actually probably was averaging closer to 75 miles a day, but I'm going to try to avoid that, but we'll see. It's like any of these like kind of record chasing things I think are interesting because for one, it's like, it's hard to compare one effort to the next because you have other variables that are going to be different from one person. I could hit bad weather through the Sierras or, better weather through the Sierras and things like that. But I'm also like, if Pete doesn't run 72.5 miles a day, I don't have his project to learn from. And I've learned a ton from his project. So like, this is definitely a scenario of like, if I break his record, or if inevitably someone comes along and breaks his record, that's just how records kind of go. It's going to be because of things that he added, things that others have added to, like, this is the right way to do it. This is the mistakes you can make. And someone getting to the point where they can fine tune it enough where, now there's very few mistakes made, very efficient stuff. But yeah, the recovery is a big one. It's really, I mean, at the end of the day, it's an injury prevention thing. Like, if you can stay injury free, that's the key, because everything is going to be slow. It's just going to be, can I continually be slow versus having to take big chunks of time off because I hurt myself and now I can't move at all, much less move slow. So that's the way I'm kind of looking at that. Recovery, I think, like, obviously protein is going to be important. Staying on top of nutrition. I can't inherit a massive calorie deficit continuously and expect it to go well. So that's going to be important for me. I think there is probably some value with projects like this, especially. I think this is where like low carb, if not even a strict ketogenic diet, really shines. Just because it's going to be more of a reliable fuel source on something this low intensity and this unpredictable at times. So I'm probably going to skew maybe a little lower carb than I would for, say, 100-mile side of things, and try to see how that goes. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. There's another guy, Dean Karnassus, who's done it. And he actually had some, I believe it was Colorado State University or one of the universities in Colorado, did a research project on him. And they actually looked at kind of his like muscle breakdown and how that worked. And it seems like with a lot of these really long things, what happens is you have this kind of like gradual descent and you kind of hit rock bottom somewhere around like a week or so. And you got to get to that point and mentally stay strong, because after that, your body kind of catches up and just says, okay. And you actually start kind of trending back upward. So your body kind of responds and figures out what it needs to do. And then as long as you're bringing in the resources you need and getting enough sleep at night, then you start trending in a more positive way. So you kind of had to hit rock bottom and not let that end your project, and then hope for things to get better and not get worse. But it is interesting how that works, because you would think it was just going to get continually worse and continually worse. But I guess that's not necessarily the case. I anticipate being sore every day, but I think it's going to be like kind of manageable. Like you can push through it as long as you stretch out and get moving and you just stay focused.
Man, well, I can't wait to follow that journey. Hopefully, everybody, you're doing that in like September. So hopefully, you'll be putting some stuff out on your social media before then so that people can follow that.
Yeah. I'm planning on doing a pretty good promotional like push before we start, especially just to kind of get eyes and ears on Fight for the Forgotten and hopefully keep that momentum through the project itself. So I'll be doing as much social media activation during it as I can get away with. I mean, one of the things about this is like I'm leaning towards kind of like a walk run strategy where I might run a little faster than Pete averaged at times, but then I might walk slower. Pete, I was pretty sure he was pretty consistent. He just ran kind of like a consistent pace basically the entire time. I think my body might respond a little better from some variety where I'm running maybe a little faster than he did, but also walking more frequently than he did. And during those walking breaks, I might just jump on IG Live and check in and just kind of share how things are going for a few minutes and keep that kind of that momentum through that sort of stuff.
That sounds totally, totally awesome. So, if my listeners want to come find you, where do they do that at?
Yeah, so kind of the one stop is my website, which is zachbitter.com. That's ZACHBITTER.com. And from there, you can link to anything from my coaching to my podcast to my social media channels. I'm most active on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is at ZachBitter, Twitter's at ZBitter.
Nice. I love that. Well, I hope they go find you. I'll put all that information in the show notes too, so that they can look you up and look into what you're doing and then follow you for your big long run.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks so much. It's been a blast to chat with you and dive into running and nutrition and everything else.
Well, I certainly appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, take care.